A woman was publicly shamed by her ex-husband at a wedding, but what unfolded afterward? The envelope was thick, expensive, and smelled faintly of jasmine. Nadia almost mistook it for a luxury brand catalog until she saw the name written in careful gold script, Dylan and Vivian. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. She hadn't seen his name in nearly 3 years, not since the day he packed his bags and said, without even flinching, "You never matched my level." The invitation was clear: her presence was requested at the wedding of her ex-husband and his new fiancée. It felt less like a courteous gesture and more like a provocation, a challenge wrapped in elegance. And yet, Nadia read it again and again, stunned that he would invite her at all. The paper sat on her coffee table for 3 days, untouched, as if contaminated with the past. Her best friend, Kara, begged her to throw it away, calling it emotional sabotage. "He's flaunting his success in your face," Kara said, arms crossed, her voice rising with protective anger. Nadia, however, wasn't so sure. There was something strange about the whole thing. Dylan had moved on quickly, too quickly, some would say. She still remembered the way he walked out, claiming she was holding him back, that her quiet ambition made him feel trapped. Attending the wedding felt absurd, but something inside her, something she couldn't quite name, told her not to look away. Not this time. The night Dylan left still played in her mind like an unfinished song. He had stood in their small apartment living room, suitcase in one hand, and said, "I can't carry dead weight anymore." She remembered the sting of those words far more vividly than the cold slam of the door that followed. Nadia had given up her dream of culinary school to support his business venture. For 2 years, she worked long shifts at a local diner, bringing home just enough to cover rent while he experimented with startup ideas. None of them succeeded, but she never threw that in his face. She thought love was about patience, about sacrifice. Dylan saw it as inertia. After the divorce, Nadia kept to herself. She moved to a modest apartment across town, took night classes in nutrition, and worked part-time at a community center. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers. She never asked for anything from Dylan, even when he landed a new job at a finance firm and started appearing on social media with expensive suits and exotic vacations. She tried not to care, but there were nights when loneliness crawled into bed beside her. Still, she had rebuilt something close to peace. Now, the invitation threatened to unravel that silence. Kara insisted she decline. Nadia said nothing, only folding the card and placing it neatly in her purse. A part of her wanted to see him again, not for closure, but to remind herself of how far she had come. The venue was a restored vineyard just outside the city, the kind of place used for magazine spreads and film backdrops. As Nadia stepped out of the taxi, the wind carried hints of lavender and crushed grapes. Her heart thudded in her chest, but she kept her head high. She wore a dark green dress, simple but elegant, and a soft shawl that belonged to her late grandmother. The valet didn't recognize her, and she was grateful for that. She wasn't there to make a statement. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there, simply, to face the chapter that once broke her and to close it with grace. Inside, the room buzzed with chatter and polished laughter. Crystals hung from the ceiling like fragile icicles. Tables glowed with candlelight and carefully arranged roses. Guests milled around in expensive suits and gowns, sipping champagne. Nadia remained at the edges, avoiding familiar faces, until she spotted Dylan across the room. He stood confidently near the bar, laughing with a group of men, his hand resting on the back of a tall, striking woman, Vivian, no doubt. Nadia watched quietly, her stomach a knot. She didn't plan to approach him. But something told her he'd make sure they crossed paths before the night was over. Nadia tried to blend into the background, weaving between conversations and lingering by the dessert table. But whispers started before the dinner was served. Someone near her gasped and muttered, "Isn't that the ex-wife?" followed by low chuckles and exchanged glances. She forced a polite smile, refusing to let it rattle her. When she took her seat, she realized with no small irony that she'd been placed at a table near the front, barely a few feet from the newlyweds. Whether by accident or design, the message was clear: her presence was not to be ignored. As the guests settled in, a woman to her right leaned over and whispered, "You're brave to come." "I wouldn't have the spine." Nadia said nothing. She didn't come for confrontation, but neither would she shrink under the weight of anyone's pity. Then came Vivian's entrance, draped in a custom designer gown, her hair curled to perfection. She looked radiant, but her eyes hardened the moment they met Nadia's. Vivian smiled thinly, whispered something in Dylan's ear, and laughed. Dylan turned his gaze slowly toward Nadia. Their eyes met. His smile was more smug than surprised. It was the same smile he wore when he left her, as if he expected her to break. But Nadia didn't flinch. The clinking of glass cut through the soft music. Dylan stood, raising his flute of champagne. The guests quieted as he began to speak. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight means the world to Vivian and me," he said, his tone warm, his grin practiced. Then, almost casually, he added, "It's funny how life works, isn't it? You think you've met your forever person, only to realize they were just a chapter in your real story." A few chuckles rippled through the room. Nadia sat motionless, her fingers tightening around her glass. "Sometimes," Dylan continued, "you have to let go of comfort to find class." The room grew quieter. He glanced toward her table, the implication sharp. "I wasted a lot of time trying to build something with someone who didn't understand vision," he said, his voice lower now. "But then I met Vivian, someone who doesn't settle, who doesn't slow me down." Laughter returned, more hesitant this time. Nadia felt the heat rise to her face, but she didn't react. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Inside, though, something shifted. Not out of anger, but clarity. Dylan hadn't changed. His cruelty still wore the mask of charm. But now, she wasn't the same woman he once left behind. Dylan raised his glass again, this time locking eyes with Vivian as if performing for the crowd. "Some people only survive in the shadows of others," he said. "They're comfortable there, hidden. But real success comes when you stand beside someone who pushes you higher." Vivian made me realize I was settling before. He grinned, satisfied with his words. The laughter that followed was scattered, uncomfortable. A few guests looked toward Nadia, some out of curiosity, others with awkward sympathy. Vivian took the mic briefly after and delivered a toast about partnerships built on ambition, not dependency, a line that made several heads turn back toward Nadia. She sat still, unmoving, her face unreadable. Inside, her pulse beat faster, but her spine stayed straight. This was no longer just a wedding, it had become a performance. And Nadia, uninvited to the stage, was still stealing the spotlight. At her table, Nadia became aware of a presence next to her. An older man in a dark navy suit, distinguished and quietly observant, turned toward her. His voice was low, but clear. That speech was unnecessarily cruel. She nodded slightly, unsure how to respond. "You're Nadia, I assume," he added, extending his hand. "I'm Walter." He didn't elaborate, nor did he blink much. Walter's gaze was not probing or pitying, it was curious, alert, even analytical. He wasn't watching her like the others, he was studying the situation. Nadia offered a polite smile, still processing his sudden introduction. "You don't seem like someone who should be sitting in the shadows," he said, echoing Dylan's words with a markedly different tone. There was no mockery in him. Just quiet interest, like he'd seen something others had missed. As dinner continued, the conversations around Nadia turned from whispers to dismissive glances. A woman across the table, dripping in diamonds, leaned in with faux curiosity. "You must be the first wife, right?" she asked sweetly, her voice syrup-thick. "I can't imagine how awkward this must be for you." Another guest snorted quietly, failing to mask her amusement. Before Nadia could respond, the woman's husband chimed in. "You know, it's generous of Dylan to invite you. Most people wouldn't have the decency." Nadia took a breath, careful not to show how deep the insult landed. She glanced at Walter, who merely raised a brow, as if inviting her to respond however she wished. But she stayed quiet. No defense would satisfy these people. They had already made up their minds. The only thing she could do now was choose when, and how, to speak. Later in the evening, Walter leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to create a private space amid the noise. "May I ask, what do you do, Nadia?" She hesitated. It wasn't shame that held her back, but a familiar doubt, conditioned by years of Dylan's subtle jabs. "I'm working in community wellness," she said softly. "Nutrition, outreach, food equity. Small-scale things." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Those aren't small things. They're the kind of work people only notice when it's gone." She glanced at him, slightly stunned. No one had ever said that to her before. He added, "You have presence. And more importantly, restraint. That's rare." He paused, then asked with a half-smile, "Would you consider meeting for coffee sometime next week?" "I'd like to discuss something." Nadia blinked, unsure. "Just a conversation," he added. "No expectations." The clinking of silverware filled the silence between Nadia's thoughts. She looked over at Dylan, now animated as ever, boasting to a group of guests about a recent investment deal he negotiated single-handedly. She knew better. During their marriage, Dylan's business ideas had floundered repeatedly, and each time, it was her who picked up extra shifts to cover rent. People assumed he had always been successful. They never saw the nights she came home from work to find him sulking on the couch, blaming the market or bad timing. She had never resented the struggle, only how quickly he erased her part in it. She had watched his failures in silence, shielding him from the shame he now projected onto her. And tonight, as he built himself higher in front of a glittering crowd, he did it by burying her story entirely. Nadia hadn't planned on telling her story that night, but the tension within her felt like a rising tide, and Walter's quiet presence seemed to open a valve. She leaned slightly toward him and began, her voice calm but steady. "Dylan lost his job 6 months into our marriage. I didn't say a word to anyone. I worked nights cleaning offices, then waitressed during the day." She paused, surprised at how effortlessly the words came now. "He'd sleep in while I got up at 5. I covered his credit card debt and even helped him register his LLC. He used to call me his anchor. Turns out, he meant it literally. I was holding him down." Walter didn't interrupt. He just nodded, as if confirming something he already suspected. "I'm sorry," he said, not with pity, but with a quiet respect that made her throat tighten. She shared with Walter a moment that never left her. They were standing in line at a grocery store, their cart filled with just enough for the week. The total came to more than what their shared debit card held. Without checking, Dylan snapped, "Didn't you say you got tips last night? Use that." Nadia could still feel the flush on her face as people stared. She remembered counting wrinkled singles in silence while Dylan looked away, embarrassed, but not at himself. Later, he blamed her for not budgeting properly, even though it was his idea to buy the imported coffee beans and artisan bread. Walter listened without asking questions. "Why did you stay?" he finally asked. Nadia exhaled slowly. "Because I believed love meant endurance. And because I didn't know I had permission to walk away." The end had come swiftly, though it felt slow in the moment. Dylan had gotten a job offer, his first real break in years. Instead of celebrating with her, he told Nadia over breakfast, "I think we both know you've outlived your role in my life." He didn't cry or show hesitation. He simply laid down the decision like a corporate memo, final and emotionless. Nadia didn't beg or protest. The humiliation was sharp, but also oddly clarifying. She packed what little was hers, left him the apartment, and started over with nothing but a few boxes and a broken heart. What hurt more than the rejection was how invisible her sacrifice became, erased from his story like a deleted file. She had been the bridge to his success, and now he was walking across her like pavement. Later in the evening, as the crowd laughed at another round of toasts, Walter slid a small card across the table. "If you're open to it," he said, "I'd like to talk more about what you've built on your own. Your background in community wellness, that's exactly the kind of thinking I look for." Nadia turned the card in her hand. It bore the logo of a well-known philanthropic investment firm. She looked at him, eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Why would someone like you be interested in someone like me?" Walter smiled, but there was no condescension in it. "Because true leadership doesn't come from privilege, it comes from pressure. And I've met enough people to recognize quiet power when I see it." Nadia didn't respond immediately, but her chest stirred with something she hadn't felt in years, possibility. Walter leaned back, letting her absorb the offer without urgency. "I'm not asking for a resume or a pitch," he said. "I'm asking for a conversation. You've been invisible too long, and frankly, that's a waste." Nadia felt a strange mixture of nerves and curiosity. She hadn't walked into this wedding expecting anything but closure. Now, she was being offered a doorway she hadn't even known existed. She slipped the card into her purse without making promises. Still, something had changed. The night had begun with stares of ridicule and cruel toasts, but it was ending with a tension that felt real. The tables had not yet turned, but the axis had shifted slightly. Dylan might have tried to bury her story, but Walter had found the parts that mattered, and wasn't afraid to say so. The MC's voice echoed through the hall, announcing a spontaneous addition to the program. "We have a special guest among us, someone who knew Dylan long before today. Let's welcome Nadia to say a few words." Heads turned. A quiet ripple passed through the crowd. Nadia froze. Her name, spoken through the mic, felt like a spotlight swinging directly on her. She looked around for a way to decline, but Walter placed a calm hand on her arm. "You don't have to," he said. But something inside her shifted. Nadia stood slowly, smoothing the fabric of her dress. Her legs trembled, but her voice would not. As she walked toward the stage, every step felt like shedding a layer of old shame. She wasn't here to retaliate, but she wasn't going to remain silent anymore. The mic was warm in her hand, and the room was unnervingly quiet. All eyes locked on her as she took a slow breath. I wasn't planning to speak tonight, she began, voice steady. But sometimes life writes its own script. A few polite smiles appeared, mostly out of courtesy, but they quickly faded as she continued. I was married to Dylan once. 4 years. Nadia glanced toward Dylan and Vivian, who sat with fixed smiles, uncertain of what was coming. During those years, I worked 3 jobs to help us stay afloat. I supported his dreams without once asking for applause. A hush fell. Silverware paused midair. I believed in him more than I believed in myself. Her eyes scanned the room, not for approval, but for truth. And it was hers now. She continued, her tone neither bitter nor performative. Thank you, Dylan, she said, locking eyes with him. Thank you for walking away. It forced me to find out what I was made of. Murmurs spread like static across the tables. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight. Vivian leaned in, whispering something that didn't seem to comfort him. Nadia's voice never rose. She didn't need to shout to be heard. I came here tonight thinking I would find closure. But what I found was a reminder that silence allows lies to grow. I stayed silent for years. Not anymore. She handed the microphone back to the MC and walked away, her posture tall. The applause didn't come immediately. First came the stillness. Then the reckoning. The room burst into applause, first scattered and awkward, then building into something uncontainable. Some guests stood, others looked away in shame. Nadia returned to her seat with a calm that surprised even her. Walter smiled quietly. That, he said, was leadership. Vivian's face was pale, her smile frozen. Dylan avoided everyone's eyes, gripping his champagne glass like a lifeline. A man from another table approached Nadia, offering his hand. That was the most honest thing I've heard at a wedding. Another woman followed, murmuring, I never knew. You carried it with so much grace. Nadia didn't bask in the praise. She hadn't done it to be admired. She did it to reclaim the space she was always told she didn't belong in. And now, she no longer needed anyone's permission to stand there. Dylan found her near the exit as guests filtered toward the garden. His voice was low, but laced with anger. Why would you do that? Here? Nadia looked at him with the kind of clarity that only comes after surviving the storm. I didn't do anything to you, Dylan. I simply told the truth. You chose the setting. His face twisted. The mask of charm he wore so tightly finally slipped. Vivian stood behind him, arms crossed, no longer clinging to his side. Is it true? She asked. Did she really carry all of that while you? She didn't finish the sentence. Dylan didn't answer. He looked at Nadia once more, but this time, there was no superiority in his eyes, only recognition. Not of the woman he left, but of the woman he could no longer dismiss. Before leaving the conversation, Nadia turned to Dylan and said with unwavering calm, but you were right about one thing back then. I wasn't the right woman for you. He raised an eyebrow, unsure whether it was a jab. She continued, because I was never meant to shrink myself for someone else's comfort. That was your need, not my failure. She gave him one last look, not with anger, but with finality. There was no part of her that wanted revenge. There was no longing left, no silent wish to rewind time. He had given her freedom wrapped in cruelty, and now she had returned with strength he could never take credit for. His silence told her he understood, maybe for the first time. Back at the table, Walter stood and greeted her with a small clap, not to draw attention, but in quiet acknowledgement. "You know," he said, "people spend fortunes to build brands that still can't command a room the way you just did." Nadia smiled faintly. "I didn't plan any of it." Walter shrugged, sipping his water. "That's why it worked. Truth doesn't need rehearsal." He handed her another card, this one with a personal number. "Call me Monday. I have 3 projects in mind, and I want your voice in them." Nadia took the card slowly, still reeling from the shift in energy around her. Just hours ago, she was an afterthought, an uncomfortable reminder of a past Dylan tried to erase. Now she had become the person no one could ignore. As guests began drifting toward the exit, Vivian approached Nadia alone. Her voice was brittle, like something freshly cracked. "I didn't know," she said, eyes darting. "He told me, well, clearly, not the full story." Nadia nodded but said nothing. She owed Vivian no explanation, and yet something in her softened. Vivian added, "If I had known, maybe I would have made different choices." "You still can," Nadia said gently, but firmly. "Just don't confuse charm with character." Vivian didn't argue. She just looked at Dylan, now surrounded by guests who avoided his eyes. "He's already planning how to spin this," she murmured. Nadia didn't reply. There was no satisfaction in Vivian's regret, only proof that truth has a way of finding its moment, eventually. The next morning, Nadia sat by her window with a cup of coffee, staring at the card Walter had given her. It no longer felt like a flattering gesture, it felt like a door. She picked up the phone and dialed. Walter answered almost immediately. "I was hoping you'd call," he said, his tone bright. "I've already cleared time for Thursday afternoon." They met at a quiet cafe near the business district. Walter came alone, no assistant, no entourage. "I don't want you for publicity," he said. "I want you because you think in terms of people, not just systems." "That's rare." He laid out 3 initiatives in need of leadership. One focused on urban food programs. Another on healthcare access. The third on women rebuilding after hardship. Nadia listened closely, her mind opening with every word. Meanwhile, Dylan spent the next week trying to mend the fallout. He issued vague statements to colleagues, blaming miscommunication and bitterness. But the wedding guests had seen the real contrast, the image of a man tearing others down versus a woman who stood tall without vengeance. The more he spoke, the worse it looked. Even Vivian grew cold. He sent Nadia a message, short, defensive. "Just wanted you to know I never meant to hurt you. Hope you're happy now." Nadia didn't reply. There was nothing more to say. Some silences speak louder than closure. She had no need to correct him, forgive him, or engage. Her life no longer required his presence, not even to define her healing. In the weeks that followed, Nadia stepped into a rhythm she never expected. Walter's team welcomed her not as a token hire, but as a collaborator. Her ideas about food equity programs, community outreach, and wellness education took root fast. For the first time, she was no longer just reacting to life, she was shaping it with intention and clarity. Her confidence grew not from praise but from purpose. She wasn't the same woman who once questioned her own value in the quiet of Dylan's shadow. Now, her name appeared on proposals, her opinions guided discussions, and her presence was no longer background, it was leadership. Each morning, she looked in the mirror and saw someone she had waited years to meet. One afternoon, her phone rang with an unknown number. She answered out of curiosity. Nadia? The voice was unmistakable, Vivian. I know I don't have the right to ask this, she said, but can we talk? Nadia hesitated, then agreed. They met at a quiet cafe, the same one where Nadia had once shared her dreams with no one listening. Vivian confessed that she'd left Dylan. He's already replaced me in his Instagram captions, she said with a bitter smile. But honestly, I'm relieved. She looked at Nadia with a mix of shame and admiration. Thank you for what you said that night. You didn't just free yourself. You woke me up. Nadia didn't gloat. She simply nodded. Sometimes the loudest redemption comes in someone else's silence. Months passed, and Nadia's reputation within Walter's network grew. She was invited to roundtable talks, asked to mentor other women rising from difficult pasts. Journalists reached out, curious about her unexpected rise. She declined most interviews. She didn't need a spotlight, just impact. But one article surfaced with the title, "The Voice at the Wedding That Changed Everything." In a modest office lined with photos of her community programs, Nadia sat beside Walter, reviewing blueprints for their next initiative. You've done more than anyone expected, he said. Including me. Nadia smiled gently. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I finally understood I could. She wasn't rebuilding her life anymore. She was building something entirely new. On a rainy Thursday morning, a press release hit every major business site. Nadia would be leading a multi-million-dollar foundation project aimed at food accessibility and health literacy. Her name stood alone, no footnote, no husband, no reference to her past. Just Nadia Bennett, founder and director. Dylan read it from his office desk, his jaw locked tight as the world moved on without him. At that moment, Nadia stood in a small community kitchen, laughing with a group of teenagers. She was teaching them how to cook affordable, nutritious meals. You don't need expensive ingredients, she told them. You need confidence, and a little fire. Her story no longer needed retelling. Her actions were doing that now, every day, with purpose, power, and peace. Nearly a year after the wedding, Nadia received a new envelope. This time, it wasn't from Dylan. It was an invitation to speak at a global women's summit, an event celebrating leaders who rose from adversity to shape the world around them. As she opened it, she smiled. There was no nervousness, no hesitation. This invitation was not a reminder of pain, but a recognition of power. She stood backstage on the day of the summit, wearing a navy dress and holding her notes. As the announcer called her name, she stepped into the spotlight, not as someone surviving humiliation, but as someone who turned it into a platform. The room went quiet, just like it had that night at the wedding. Only this time, they weren't waiting for scandal. They were waiting for her story. And she was finally ready to tell it all,